Welcome to Critical Disability Studies, Implications for Justice-Oriented Arts Education. I'll introduce myself momentarily, but first want to provide a few access notes. In addition to the slide deck, which I'll describe throughout the session, there is a video panel in the top right of your screen that shows my face while I'm speaking. I'm a white woman in my 30s with red curly hair and glasses. I'm wearing a white shirt and a navy blue blazer. I'm sitting in front of a bright green wall with many multicolored postcards, images, and books on it. Hi, I'm Jenna. On the left side of this slide is a picture of me. I'm smiling and looking at the camera in front of a green wall with a bookcase that's kind of blurred out, and I'm wearing a cream shirt. I'm a PhD student at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, where my research looks at the intersection of critical disability studies and special education in arts learning contexts. I specifically look at how critical disability studies can guide the development of justice-based arts pedagogies, particularly for disabled learners. I'm also an instructor in the Department of Art Education, where I support undergraduate and graduate pre-service teachers in working with students with disabilities. This session will offer a very brief introduction to critical disability studies, focusing specifically on how we understand disability and can apply those understandings to the work of anti-ableist arts education. So we'll define critical disability studies and talk about ways that it can inform arts instruction. In my work, I refer to this as a need for critical theory and also for critical practice. So we'll discuss this today. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time exploring 4 models of disability and what each can offer an anti-ableist arts pedagogy. I want to stress that this is a very introductory session. It is in no way meant to be a deep dive into critical disability studies or a thorough exploration of the intersections between critical disability studies, special education, and the arts. Rather, this is an overview of one piece of what I think critical disability studies can offer to us as a field. I talk a lot about arts education that is anti-ableist. So I want to start by situating us in the definition of ableism that I use in my work. This comes from T.L. Lewis, and I will read directly from the slide. Ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. I want to draw your attention to a few aspects of this definition that I think are important for education in the arts. First, ableism is an oppressive system. It's structural and it permeates every aspect of our society. Second, Lewis doesn't actually say disability. They talk about oppression that's based on bodies and minds that exist outside the range of a predetermined norm. This acknowledges the myriad ways disability is experienced. Visible and invisible, physical, cognitive, and sensory, static and shifting, identity and impairment. These are the experiences that different models of disability try to understand and define. Next, ableism tells us that there's a right way to learn, achieve, communicate, behave, look, and exist. This definition reminds us that that rightness is deeply entrenched in the culture of white supremacy, and the forces of capitalism, colonialism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, and racism shape our students' experiences of education hand in hand with ableism. So when I say this definition is particularly important to us as arts educators, I say that to acknowledge our role in challenging this system and in understanding the ways that the history of arts and arts education have been shaped by these forces. I want to be clear that it's impossible to practice anti-ableism in art education without also providing culturally sustaining pedagogies, practicing critical multiculturalism, and offering safe and loving community for our LGBTQIA+ students. I tell my students frequently that there's a dangerous tendency in our work to single issue disability, and that we have a responsibility to take a more intersectional approach that decenters whiteness in our practice. I think Lewis offers us a jumping off point for this in the last sentence. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. We're all shaped by the system. Our experiences of ableism influence everything in our pedagogy. Our perspective and perceptions of our students, our attendance and grading policies, the ways that we allow and encourage our students to show up. Our first step in learning and doing better is reflecting critically on our experiences with ableism. When I think about anti-ableism in the art room, right, so an arts pedagogy that works directly in opposition to the definition we just went through, I think about how this necessitates a shift from the goal of compliance to a goal of justice. Arguably, our education system operates from a disability rights framework, with certain protections in place for students who receive special education services. Without diving deeply into a critique of special education law, I would argue that anti-ableist classrooms go further than simply complying with what the law requires. Anti-ableist teachers go above and beyond those requirements and work to ensure that all of their students have the supports that they need to succeed. This is ongoing, active, reflexive work. So I argue that anti-ableist art education is both critical theory and critical practice. From a critical theory perspective, anti-ableist art education necessitates questioning who benefits under the special education system and why. Advocating for more inclusive practices as opposed to relying on separate environments, and understanding disability as a social construct, an identity, and an experience. At the same time, we're taking this critical stance toward the sociocultural forces shaping our students' education. We also have to acknowledge that we teach real students who are caught up in the system. So anti-ableist art education is also critical practice. This is about designing environments in which disabled learners thrive. It's about providing multimodal differentiated instruction and about normalizing the use of visual aids, adaptive tools, and sensory supports. These are the practices that a lot of teachers, particularly educators like you who attend conferences like this, are already doing. So anti-ableist art education isn't about reinventing those practices or disavowing any place for special education in the art room. It's about recontextualizing them so that they can be employed in a way that is more devoted to a just understanding of who our students with disabilities are. So let's start by diving into critical theory. Critical disability studies is an interdisciplinary field of study that originated as disability studies during the disability rights movement. As a field of scholarship, critical disability studies looks at disability as an experience, an identity, and a mode of analysis for a broad range of social issues. We don't have time today to do a deep dive into the history and evolution of critical disability studies, but I do want to highlight what I believe are three themes that are necessary to understanding where we've been, where we are, and where we can go in the field. The first is the way that critical disability studies has evolved from its original articulation as just disability studies coming out of the disability rights era through what I call critical entanglements. These are intersections with other fields of thought that have led to an increased criticality in the field. We can see a historical relationship between disability studies and feminist theory, queer theory, crip theory, and critical race theory. And coming out of each of these entanglements, we've seen the field become more expansive in its understandings. I also think it's important that we acknowledge the influence of what I refer to as the medical social model bifurcation, which addresses the impact of the medical and social models of disability, which we'll talk about shortly, and how the field works to further a more nuanced understanding of disability. Finally, critical disability studies is deeply connected to the practice of disability justice. And I think that that bridge between theory and practice is something that arts education can learn from. There are many models of disability, and we're certainly not going to get through all of them in 20 minutes, but there are four that I'd like to explore today. We'll talk about the medical or individual model, the social model, the affirmation model, and the political relational model. As the name would suggest, the medical model of disability draws from medical data to diagnose and remediate the negative functional impact of a person's disability. This is also referred to as the individual model because it very much understands disability as a personal issue, something that's situated in an individual who is experiencing the medical condition of their disability. This model understands disability as abnormal, pathological, and in need of intervention, a purely medical problem. So professionals employ remedial approaches to alleviate the negative effects of a person's disability. Special education research, practice, and policy draw heavily from this model, positioning special educators as being responsible for that remediation in the classroom. Many disability advocates and disability studies scholars reject this model outright because it places the burden on the disabled individual to make themselves more like non-disabled people. And it positions that non-disabledness as the normal to which we all should aspire. The social model, which is often framed as the opposite of the medical model, tells us that society causes disability. In the social model, disability is seen as an expression of human diversity, something that is only rendered abnormal because of environment. Society has built environments and designed services that are made inaccessible to people with disabilities. So it's that inaccessibility of the environment, of services or information that creates disability. And the burden is on society to address these issues, not the disabled individuals themselves. This very simple graphic shows the relationship between the medical and social model. In the middle of the slide is a graphic of a woman who is a wheelchair user, and she's sitting in her wheelchair at the bottom of a flight of stairs, which have a sign on them that says, "Weigh in, everyone welcome." And on the left, we see the medical model of disability telling us her impairment is the problem. They should cure her or give her prosthetics. And on the right, we see the social model of disability telling us that the stairs are the problem. They should build a ramp. And indeed, there's this way that we can look at this and see, yeah, with a ramp, this woman can go into the event like her peers who are physically able to climb the stairs. But while this may have addressed an access concern, putting in a ramp doesn't simply erase her disability. And this exposes several limitations of the social model. The limitations I want to talk about all rest on a series of false binaries that the social model creates. In situating itself as this direct opposite to the medical model, it creates some unnecessary divides or oversimplifications between the two models, also between the concept of disability and impairment, and of disabled and non-disabled. Tom Shakespeare outlines 4 specific limitations. He's not the first scholar to surface these, but I highlight his piece because it puts them together in a clear and succinct way. First, the limited definition of disability in the social model doesn't leave a lot of room for experiences of impairment. So people with pain or chronic illness, with cognitive or sensory disabilities, these aren't really captured as the social model privileges folks with more static physical disability experiences. The social model positions oppression as a defining part of disability, which Shakespeare argues actually makes it more difficult to understand the relationship between disability and oppression. In situating the issue of disability exclusively within society, the social model ignores the reality that disability is actually both an individual experience and something that is societally constructed. And finally, it oversimplifies considerations for accessibility. So to go back to our graphic, Shakespeare is specifically pushing back on the idea that this woman is going to suddenly go into the event and not be disabled. Accessibility needs to be more responsive than just a checklist, and it also needs to honor folks' identities as disabled people. This is another area where we can see how people whose disabilities affect them in more complex ways aren't fully served by the definition of disability that the social model puts forth. So these limitations give rise to other models of disability. John Swain and Sally French put forth an affirmation model that is designed to extend the social model. They critique the social model and the medical model because both of them take a tragedy view of disability. So the social model tells us disability isn't a tragedy in the disabled person, but it does still take a negative view of disability by putting a tragedy or burden on society. So they reject this ideal of a normal that creates that tragedy view and instead position disability as a constructed identity, like race, class, or gender. So ableism becomes a cultural issue. The model values the lived experience and unique knowledge of disabled people and is really rooted in the expression of disability as something to be proud of and in understandings of the experience of disability that come directly from disabled people themselves. Finally, I want to talk about Alison Kafer's political relational model, which she calls a friendly departure from the social model. She writes about the tension between the medical and social models and how she doesn't want to disavow the role of medical intervention in, for example, helping her pain. But at the same time, she doesn't want to lose her affiliation with the disability community and with disability politics. So the model of disability that she puts forth embraces this nuance. This model places the medical model in a social and political context, asking critical questions about access to medical care and supports, and raising attention to the way that social issues impact health. And she talks about disability as contested terrain and as a political project for radically reimagining more accessible futures. Finally, she tells us that disability affects everyone in their interactions, relationships, or through the eventuality of disability in old age. It doesn't exist in isolation. So what do these models offer to us as practitioners? I want to first suggest that we don't approach these models as either or, that each has something to offer us in the work of radically reimagining arts learning environments that enable rather than disable students. So as a conclusion, I've grabbed one key implication from each model that I hope you'll consider in your practice. From the political relational model, teaching is political. By this, I mean we bring our whole selves to this work, and we do this work in environments that are shaped by social, cultural, and political systems. Rather than pretending otherwise, anti-ableist art education should explicitly acknowledge those contexts and work to dismantle the ways in which they generate oppressive conditions for our students. From the affirmation model, recognize, develop, and value students' identities. In anti-ableist arts classrooms, we see disabled learners represented in the curriculum, and we see their disability identities named and celebrated. We support our students in talking about their disability identity outside of only the deficit positioning in conversations about their needs. From the social model, design environments with accessibility in mind. This is our work as teachers, to create environments in which students thrive and to take on the burden of making sure that they have what they need to succeed. It's essential that we take a flexible and responsive approach to this, viewing accessibility as a conversation rather than a checklist. And from the medical model, individualized instruction can alleviate the felt impacts of impairment in the classroom. While we should critique the reliance of special education on the medical model, and we should push back on the notion that our students with disabilities need to be remediated through our instruction, I do think it's important that we acknowledge that there are strategies and practices that came from special education literature that are a valuable part of supporting students with disabilities in the classroom. And there are disabled learners who have benefited greatly from special education services. So we can take what is useful, contextualize it, and employ it in service of more just environments. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. I welcome any questions or connections via email at gabrielj@vcu.edu or over Instagram at antiableist.art.ed. Enjoy the rest of this year's Able Assembly.